Hey YouTube, this is Guy. If you saw my previous and most recent video, it was a review on the Seiko Turtle SRP773. In that video I told you I was going to be reviewing this watch that's on the table in the very near future. This watch is the Seiko Sumo SBDC-033. And what I've got going on here is sort of a series of review videos. Quite a while in the past, I reviewed the Seiko SKX007. I, again, just recently reviewed the Seiko Turtle SRP773, and now I'm going to do this Sumo. Later on this week, I'm going to do a three-way comparison of all three of those watches, so keep an eye out for that, and that will sort of be the culmination of this Seiko Diver review series. But first things first, I want to cover the basics and set down a foundation for the Sumo, just like I did for the other two watches, and basically avoid having to cover all of that, standard information in the three-way comparison. So what we have here on the table, again, is the Seiko Sumo SBDC-033. This, like the other two watches, is an ISO certified 200-meter water resist dive watch. First things first, price points. This is probably the most expensive of the three. Comes in between $450 and $500, depending on gray market or authorized dealer purchase, where you get it from, basically. But yeah, you're going to be in that definitely over $400 price point for brand new retail, maybe just under $500. To cover the basic specs on this watch, before we talk about my opinions on the overall design and features and functionality and aesthetics, we'll just knock that out real quick. The specs on this are a case diameter of 44 millimeters. That's what the specs that I found online say. However, on my calipers, it's much closer to a case diameter of 45 millimeters. So, take that for what it's worth. We got 13 millimeters in thickness and, interestingly, 20 millimeter lugs, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And the final measurement that I find is super critical for all watches is from the top of the lugs to the bottom of the lugs, the lug-to-lug width, or what I like to call the watch's wingspan. This watch has a pretty wide wingspan at 52 millimeters on my calipers. So also, that's going to be an interesting point when we do the three-way comparison. The other basic specs about this watch are pretty standard for Seiko dive watches. We have 200-meter water resist, we have a screw-down crown at the 4 o'clock position, and we have a screw-down case back. We have, interestingly, only a date complication at the 3 o'clock as opposed to day and date. We do have a unidirectional elapsed time bezel. The crystal on this is a Hardlex crystal, so while it's a more expensive diver in the affordable line of Seiko dive watches, it does not feature sapphire crystal. It is just Hardlex. The dial layout features LumiBrite, glow-in-the-dark luminescent paint on all of the markers as well as the handset, and at the 12 o'clock position on the bezel there's a little pip with LumiBrite luminescence as well. The bracelet on this is a pretty nice bracelet. It's a stainless steel bracelet. The clasp is what we would call a double locking clasp with fold over and dual push button deployment. Pretty standard clasp for most Seiko watches on their bracelets, but overall a fairly nice bracelet. And again, it does have a diver's extension. If you watched that Turtle review, that bracelet also has a diver's extension. Last but not least, the movement in this watch is the upgraded and I guess you would definitely say it's better than the other watches' movements. It's the 6R15. Let's talk about that 6R15 just a little bit before we continue. The 6R15 movement is a 23 joule automatic movement. It does have manual winding and hacking. It has a 50-hour power reserve, and the beat or vibrations per hour on this watch or movement is 21,600. Probably one of the most notable improvements about this movement over the other watches is, out of the box, the accuracy range is quite a bit better. It will have a specification that states it will be no slower than 15 seconds per day, no faster than 25 seconds per day overall. So a better accuracy rating out of the box from the factory than either of the other two watches, which we'll of course discuss once we get to that three-way comparison video later on this week. First things first though, let's talk about what I think about this watch. It is, again, the most expensive of those three watches, and I think I can see why. I'm going to kind of close in here a little bit. And first thing I want to talk about is the case. The case on this watch is, well, it's covered with fingerprints. So let me just give it a little wiped down for you guys so you don't have to look at all that and get a better judge on it. The case on this watch, though, it is a very attractive case. For a Seiko watch in their more affordable line of watches, I mean, it is still a dive watch, it is a tool watch, but this case is a little bit more like jewelry than the other watches that you're going to find from Seiko in particular. They're more affordable dive watches. And the reason I say that is because it's really pretty nicely finished, and it's very interestingly designed. First things I want to show you is the side of the case. We have a number of, I don't know if we would call them facets or layers, and I have a lot of light going on here, so I don't know how well this is going to show up. But we have this under area that's pretty highly polished. You can see my reflections of the camera and, my finger reflection in here. We have this nice super high polished, but it's kind of at an angle. Then it comes up to this facet, a brushed line, very crisp, clean lines in between each of these areas. Then we come up again to another polished section. Finally, on the top of the lugs, we have this nice brushing again. And if we actually look at the very tip tops of the lugs, there's even another facet right in there. See if I can get a good angle on it. So we have this polished part, and then this additional little facet on this side. You can see it even better right in here. So it's got all of these different layers. It's really interesting. By comparison, we'll just do a quick look at the SKX that I'm wearing today. It's all just a nice, smooth, rounded off case. There's really not a whole lot going on as far as the design and the geometry of the case. But on this Sumo, it is really interesting. Another interesting thing, because it has 20mm lugs, the width here, lug-to-lug width, the actual lugs themselves are kind of almost oversized. And if you look at the end link on the bracelet, it's really set inside, kind of down into in between the lugs. There's a bit of a gap there, but I mean, it's intentional and I think it's, well-meaning and well-designed. It is, I don't know, it just gives it a little, again, different geometry than I'm used to on Seiko watches, but I like it. I think it's well done. Another interesting thing about the case is you can see the bezel here, and we'll talk about the bezel in a bit, but the bezel is set down inside of the case. As I rotate the bezel, you see that on the sides here, you really can't get much of a grip on the bezel because it's down in the case. The case kind of hugs the bezel. You can really only get a grip on it on the top side and the bottom side. That's another cool design feature that they did. And again, why I say it's a little bit more like jewelry, although it still is a robust dive and tool watch. It's just designed, I think, a little more, I don't know, for interest maybe. It's not all function. I guess form follows function, is that the saying? It's not all function. It's someone sat down and thought about this when they were designing it to give it a certain look and a certain feel. And again, for me, it's just a little bit more of a piece of jewelry than just a standard tool watch or dive watch. On the opposing side of the case, we have all that same polishing, brushing, brushing, and then little bits of polishing on the tops of the lugs there. All those same layers. Very, very nicely done. And, I mean, you're not going to get the overall impression of it on my camera here with all of these... with all of the fingerprints all over it, but very, very nicely done for a relatively affordable Seiko watch, again in the sub $500 price point. So yeah, suffice to say I like the case. I think it's a really nice design, although the overall top to bottom lug to lug width, or that wingspan that I talked about, does make the watch wear a little bit bigger in my opinion. Yes, it's 44mm in diameter, or maybe 45 based on the way my caliper measures it, which is big in its own right, but you can get away with that diameter if the lugs aren't super long. But this one, the lugs are long, so it's going to kind of wrap around the wrist, and if you're as thin or small-wristed person, you might find that to be a bit of an issue. On me and my 7-inch wrists, not a big deal. I can pull it off. I've worn it around the house a little bit. And I guess I should probably, I don't know if I said it in the very intro, this is on loan from a viewer. So I haven't worn it a ton. I've worn it around the house quite a bit though, just to get a feel for it so I could give you my opinions on it in the review. And anyway, like I said, because it has this, 52-ish millimeter lug-to-lug width, it wears large. It wants to wrap around the wrist. And I'll give you a wrist shot of it a little bit later on and after we talk about the bracelet. But yeah, it's big. It wears big. That's the point. Bigger than either of the other two Seiko watches that we were talking about earlier. Not bad, again, but if you are thin-wristed, slim-wristed, you could probably have a problem with that. Thickness-wise, it's not bad. It's in the ballpark of most of Seiko's dive watches at 13-ish millimeters thick, so that's not a problem. It's just that it's a little bit big in the diameter, and quite a bit bigger than your average Seiko watch in the overall lug-to-lug width. Another nice thing about the case is we have drilled lug holes, and that's kind of funny to me. The SKX does not have drilled lug holes. I can't remember if the Turtle does. I have it here on my table. Let me take a look real quick. The Turtle does have drilled lug holes, but I would have thought that this watch here would not have drilled lug holes, again, because it's so nice and thoughtfully finished and designed. It does potentially throw off the design, I think, a little bit, having those holes on the sides of the cases. If I was the designer, I would probably not do it. I understand that, it is super convenient to have drilled lug holes if you're the type of person that likes to change out your bracelet with all sorts of different straps. But for me, on this piece, I would have went with the solid case with no drilled lug holes. I think it would have been a better design choice, aesthetically. Because of what it is, because it's such an attractive piece. It's made to stand out and look a little bit flashy, I think. Another interesting design choice is that, again, they did 20 millimeters on the lugs here. Most Seiko dive watches, at least the other two that we're talking about, the SKX and the Turtle, have 22 millimeter lug-to-lug width, so you have a 22 millimeter bracelet. This bracelet starts out at 20 millimeters, and I'm curious, I didn't measure it. Let me grab my calipers real quick here. Does it taper very much? It looks visually like it does. Let's take a look. Yeah, it does. It tapers down to about 18 to 18 and a half, somewhere around there, a little over 18 millimeters. So you're starting out at 20 millimeters up here, and it tapers down to 18. That's a little delicate for the size of the watch, I think. It may be... I'm sure some people are going to say it should have been 22 millimeters, like the SKX and like the Turtle. But again, I feel like they were going for a different feel and a different vibe with this watch. I think they wanted it to be a little more elegant and a little less about function and tool watch and yada yada yada. I think they were going for something a little bit different when they designed this watch. So maybe the 20 millimeter lug width with the taper down to 18 millimeters on the bracelet is called for. But I know for a fact that my friend that loaned this to me, the viewer that loaned this to me, doesn't really think too highly of the 20 millimeter lug width in particular because of how the bracelet fits. What that 20 millimeter lug width also does is it makes the lugs themselves feel a little bulky. If you look at, the edge of the case up to here, the lugs are very prominent. If we had an extra millimeter of width on either side for the bracelet there, it would slim those down. So that might be something that doesn't appeal to you. I don't find it to be a problem, but I could obviously understand where someone might think that the proportions are a little bit off because of the lug width, because of the bracelet, because it tapers down to 18 millimeters at the clasp end. The proportions might not be for you. I don't dislike them, though. I think, again, if you take into context what I believe to be true, that they weren't going necessarily for a strict, hard-use tool watch, and they were trying to make something a little more elegant and a little bit more like jewelry. And, I don't think it's a terrible choice. And it adds options on the marketplace. I mean, there's so many dive watches. This is quite a bit different than the other affordable Seiko dive watches, be it the SKX, be it the Turtle, be it the Monster, the Sea Urchin, whatever. This stands on its own as a very unique design. Now, The case is, I probably covered the case too much, honestly, but I think it was one of the more interesting elements of this watch, and I really wanted to do that justice. So we'll talk about some of the other aspects of it. Case back, very typical screw-down case back, got the tsunami wave engraved on there. Nothing super special there to show you guys, so I won't harp on that too long. The crown at the 4 o'clock position is typical, except that we don't have hardly any crown guards at all. It does sit recessed, and I'll unscrew it just so you can see it a little bit better. It does sit recessed into the case ever so slightly, but no traditional crown guards to speak of. That said, the threading on the crown, very nice. It does have a little bit of wobble when it's out to the first position where you would hand wind the movement. Hand winding is super smooth, as has always been my experience on the 6R15 Seiko movement. Of course, this is a hacking movement as well as hand winding, so if we pull out to the second position, the watch stops and we could adjust the time, how you would on just about any other watch on the market that features a hacking movement. Push it back in to the first position and the movement starts right back up. Threading it in is super simple. A little downward pressure catches those threads very nicely, winds down perfectly. The crown is signed with the Seiko S, which is not too uncommon for Seiko's watches. Moving right along, though, we'll talk about the bezel. This is something that I don't particularly love about this watch. Not so much the fact that the bezel is set into the case like I had showed you before. I think that's kind of, again, a cool design feature, something a little bit different. What I don't like is the font on the bezel. It just doesn't appeal to me. You know, it's not something that I think most people are probably going to notice. It is on this particular model, on the 033, blue bezel, of course, blue dial. That font, it's kind of a very modern, contemporary, bold font, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50. The little dots they're okay, but the whole thing, it's very pronounced. The font's pronounced. The actual bezel itself is a little bigger than the bezel that you would find on an SKX, and I'll kind of bring that in to show you. There's the SKX on my wrist. That bezel's a little thinner from, the edge to edge, and the fonts are a little more understated. The dots are a little more pronounced, but the little hash marks at the odd numbers, at the 15, 25, 35, and so on, that's a little more understated. I prefer that. On this, everything on the bezel is very big and loud. And again, I think, this is my theory, they were going for kind of a big, loud, I used the word elegant earlier, and something being kind of big and loud and elegant, that doesn't really make a lot of sense, I guess. So, but, just something flashy, I guess. I think that's what they were going for. And that's the way that the bezel is designed sort of, I think, reinforces my theory there. I could be wrong, I don't know. I haven't spoken to anybody at Seiko, any of their designers, but that's just my theory on it, is they were going for something flashy and bold and kind of maybe sexy and elegant at the same time, something that is, again, more like jewelry, less of a tool watch. So that could be what they were thinking when they went with the design on this bezel in particular, just the proportions of the font and the overall width from edge to edge on the bezel, the whole thing. Again, it's just I don't hate it, but I don't love it either. The edge of the bezel, it's fine. You get a good grip, but you can only grip it on the top and the bottom. Again, you can't really grip it on the sides like you would on any other dive watch that I have experience with. But the action is very, very nice and buttery smooth. Everything lines up on it quite well, this particular example, as we're probably all well aware. Seiko's known for having alignment issues, quality control issues, for lack of a better word. This watch, I don't see any quality control problems. Everything lines up very good. Everything looks very good. And again, the 120 click unidirectional bezel, the action feels great. There's not a whole bunch of play and wiggle once you've stopped it. You can kind of bring it backwards just a hair, and then it's snug. It's right in there. I do like this bezel from that regard, or from that perspective. I think it's very well made. Just aesthetically, not perfect in my opinion. Moving along though, the crystal is Seiko's Hardlex crystal. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. It's their proprietary mineral crystal, some sort of hardened mineral crystal that they make or have made. They use it on the vast majority of their watches, unless the watch happens to use sapphire. I wish that this watch did have a sapphire crystal, considering its nearly $500 price point. I think that it deserves to have an upgrade in that regard. For that price, I think it should be a sapphire crystal. That said, I've never ever had any problems with a Hardlex crystal. I've never scratched one, I've never shattered one. And if we look at this one here, this is again on loan from a viewer. I don't know how long he's had it or how much he's worn it, but it looks perfect to me. So Hardlex does stand up. There's nothing really wrong with it. I think just because it's supposedly better on paper, that's what we all want. You know, I'm guilty of that as too. I'm guilty of that as well, I guess. But yeah, Hardlex crystal. The dial, the handset, the layout of this watch, very nice, very typical Seiko. Circle applied indices at the hour markers, with the exception of 6-9, which share a similar kind of oblong square marker. And then at the 12 you have this upside down triangle, which has sort of this little hash at the bottom edge of it. The dust, we'll get rid of that. The markers, again, they're all outlined in a very nice shiny stainless steel. Very nice layout, very good layout. It's not you know, what's the word I'm looking for? Dissimilar to the other, I guess, Seiko watches that I'm going to do the three-way comparison. They all have the same, similar, not same, but very similar layout with the circles and some sort of markers at 6, 9, and 12 that differentiate it from the rest of the hours. The handset on this watch is quite nice. The hour hand features that little sort of chevron at the tip, kind of in the middle, I guess. Then the loomed section is like another little arrow or chevron. I like that. I think that that's a nice looking hour hand. The minute hand, kind of plain. I wish it had the arrow that the other watches that we've discussed had. I think that would be a little cooler. But for whatever reason, they just went with this standard, I don't know, almost like a fence post. The second hand is interesting, though. At the tip of it, you have a little loomed kind of, I don't even know what you call that. It sort of looks like a tombstone to me, if I'm being honest. But it has a little hash or slash in the center of it, kind of matches the hour in a way. It's obviously not a chevron. It's a little bit different, but it's interesting. It's cool. It looks good in my opinion. Of course, the handset and all of the indices, the markers, the applied markers on this dial feature Seiko's LumiBrite glow-in-the-dark luminescence. I'll roll in some video of the lume on this watch here so that you guys can see how it looks after getting a full charge from a flashlight for a minute or so. It's good. It's Seiko's lume. We all know Seiko's lume is great. There's not really a whole lot to say about it. Suffice to say that it's LumiBrite. It's awesome. End of story. Next we will talk about the branding on this dial just briefly because it's something that people discuss. I'm going to pull out the crown and I'm going to move the handset a little bit just so we can see it better. Screw that back down. Very, very nice threading screw action on this watch. Not gritty or anything. So we have Seiko's logo at the 12 o'clock position, very typical Seiko. Just below the handset, we have the Prospex X logo, and that's a point of contention for some people. Some people don't like it. I've seen more than a few complaints on the internet about that. I don't really understand why. I think it looks fine. If it wasn't there, I wouldn't miss it. The fact that it is there doesn't really detract anything from me. Just below that, we have the word automatic, to signify that this is an automatic movement watch. And below that, divers 200 meter. Of course, that it says divers indicates that it is an ISO certified dive watch. I believe, I mean, I don't know who enforces this, but I believe that you cannot put divers or dive watch on a watch unless it is certified ISO 64 something. I forget the numbers, but it's a very stringent testing regimen that watches go through to ensure that they are durable and robust dive watches. I believe if it didn't go through those certifications or testing, that it would just say like water resist or water resistant. Down at the very, very bottom of the watch in super tiny super tiny font, Japan, 6R15, and something over on the right side is just too small for me to even read. And that's it. That's your dial, with the exception of the chapter ring on the outer edge. Same style chapter ring that we have on the SKX and the Turtle. I love these chapter rings, with the exception that they can very frequently be misaligned when they are installed. Because it's a separate piece from the dial sits down below it. This chapter ring sits between the glass and the dial at, a slanted angle. And when they put it in, it could be off, a few degrees one way or the other. That can be very annoying. This one, though, very well aligned. So yeah, that's awesome. I guess, what else can we talk about here? I haven't touched on the bracelet a whole lot yet. Bracelet's nice. First things first, end links are solid end links. So that's, a step above the SKX for sure. The end link meets the bracelet. The bracelet has a sort of subtle, it's all brushed. There's a few little nicks on it. My buddy that loaned it to me, obviously, wears it a bit, so there's a few little tiny nicks on it. Nothing that you would get from a brand new one, of course. But anyway, what I want to say is the center links, the edges have kind of like a little polished edge on either side of the center portion of the links. Again, which makes me believe that this is meant to be kind of a dressed up, a little bit more flashy, a little bit more jewelry styled watch. In the design process, I feel like that's what they were thinking about. But it's a nice bracelet. It's comfortable. One thing I dislike about bracelets like this, the center portion, the whole link is just one piece. I like when the center portion is separate. And you can see as I'm tilting it there, that is obviously one single piece. Now let me show you what I mean, just in case you're not 100% understanding me. I like a watch that has totally separate, so you see like the ends are separate from the center. It's more flexible. In my mind, for my money, it just tends to be a little more comfortable when the links are all separated like that. But this watch does just have one solid piece for the entire link. Now, why that's kind of interesting is, let's say you want to set your watch down on the counter, right? Like we all do this at night, set our watch down or whatever. It won't really flatten out because of those solid single links. Not a big deal, but to me it's just something that I dislike. You can't like really nicely, it kind of flops, whatever. I'm being nitpicky, I understand that. You guys are probably rolling your eyes at me, but if I had my choice, I would have that center area be totally separate piece so that they move independently. It makes the bracelet a little more flexible. This bracelet is very rigid. There's not much flex in it at all. If you like a really stiff, rigid bracelet, then maybe this is exactly what you want. I have the Jubilee on the SKX. I like loose, floppy bracelets. So by just adding that extra joint, I guess, that would be just a little bit looser and a little more flexible, I think, in my experience based on other watches. So we have, at the end of the bracelet, of course, the clasp. It's a very standard, typical Seiko clasp, which is to say it's not awesome. It's got the fold-over safety portion of the clasp, 2 buttons on either side to deploy the clasp, and, that's it. The swing arm is typical, cheap, thin metal, stamped metal, and the clasp itself is also just very inexpensive, not very robust stamped metal. On the upside, we do have 4 micro adjustment holes, which I can appreciate. So you can move, the little spring bar there, move that fore and aft, and adjust the sizing in, 1 or 2 millimeter increments. But it's a very typical Seiko bracelet, and a very, very typical Seiko clasp. Again, just the clasps on these watches are mediocre. I've never had one break on me or fall off or anything like that, though, so I really shouldn't be that hard on them. They're just not all that great. But anyway, it is signed with the Seiko name, logo on the fold-over portion. And it does have a diver's extension. If you open up the clasp here, there's this little hinge on the bottom. I'm not going to illustrate it because my fingernails are really short and it's hard to open, but you unhinge that, and then this little piece here unhooks, and you get about 5 or 6 or so millimeters of extension if you were scuba diving and you wanted to fit it over a wetsuit. It's something I'm never going to utilize, but it is there if that's a feature that you care about. Well, anyway, that's basically everything there is to say about the Seiko Sumo SBDC-033. It's a really great, I would call it great. It's a great dive watch in the affordable line of Seiko dive watches. I mean, you know, $400 to $500 isn't super cheap, but it's not a luxury watch. It's not $1,000. It's not $2,000. It's not $5,000. It's affordable for most people, I think, and it's nice. I think that, again, because of the size, and let me throw it on the wrist. I forgot about that, so I can show you how it wears. And I'll give you a sort of a before here, right? So I'm going to zoom the camera out, show you the SKX on my wrist, and then I'll throw this on for you to see the differences. So there's the SKX on my wrist. You can see, and I want to talk about this dimension here, the lug to lug. Look where it lines up, right? It doesn't want to hug over the sides of my wrist. So keep that in mind. Now I'm going to throw on the Sumo for you. So you can see that that bigger lug to lug dimension really does make this watch appear bigger. I mean, the case dimensions aren't all that much bigger than the SKX, in my opinion. It's just that one single dimension. So there we go. You can see the lugs do, they want to curve around the wrist a bit. It's not bad though. I mean, again, I have a 7-inch wrist and it fits me just fine, but it does wear quite a bit larger than the SKX if you're familiar with that. And, you know, just looking at them, you can kind of see it, I think. But it's comfortable. It's not really overwhelmingly large. It's a bit heavier, I would guess. I didn't put it on a scale, but feeling it on my wrist here, it is a bit heavier. I think it's probably the bracelet. The bracelet on that SKX is super light, but very nice looking. And again, a kind of dressed up or not dressy, certainly not, but just kind of flashy. Just a little more visually interesting, I think, when you look at that case than a typical dive watch. It's very distinct. It's very unique. So if you're looking for something like that, if you're looking for a sport watch or a dive watch or something that you can really wear out, you know, if you're, I don't know, going out for a night or whatever, and you don't want to wear a dressy watch, so you don't want to be super classy, but you want something a little flashy, you know, this is, I think, a really good option. And again, it is a very robust tool watch too. I mean, you can take it diving, do whatever with it. It's a dive watch as well. So anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. That's my review of the Sumo SBDC-033. Appreciate you guys for tuning in as always. I hope you enjoyed it. And going to do that review of the SKX, the Turtle, and the Sumo side by side. Not really a review, just a comparison of those watches this coming week. So keep an eye out for that. All right, guys. Thanks a lot. Take care. Bye now.